Hello, my beautiful watchers, and welcome to Lost in Adaptation, the internet review show that looks at films based on books to see if they stay true to their source material or were very, very naughty little adaptations. Interview with the Vampire, published in 1976, was a gothic horror novel written by American author Anne Rice. Rice wrote, or at least rewrote, the book during the worst time of her life, having just lost her 6-year-old daughter to cancer. Interview was her first published book, and the first of 11 sequels she would go on to write in a series referred to as the Vampire Chronicles. In yet another case of an adaptation being stalled by development hell, the film rights were originally purchased the same year as the book was published, but ended up getting passed around studios for almost 2 decades before the adaptation eventually finally happened in 1994, directed by Neil Jordan. Jordan is a filmmaker with a more varied resume than most, with projects spanning between uber-low-budget art house productions and big studio films, Interview being one of his more mainstream successes. He's also an accomplished novelist himself, so it's going to be very interesting to see if that makes him more or less inclined to respect the source material he's working from. Who wrote the screenplay for this film seems to be slightly in question. Rice is credited as the writer, but apparently one of Jordan's stipulations for making the film was that he be allowed to write the script himself. It might have been a case of him incorporating or rewriting her pre-existing screenplay, or it might have been entirely the work of one or the other, but they just couldn't reflect that in the credits for contractual reasons. Once you see the review in full, you'll see why I wasn't confident in guessing. Before that though, let's quickly go over my thoughts on the book as an individual entity. When I read this for the first time, I didn't know about Rice's late daughter, but it made perfect sense to me as soon as I was informed about it. I'm usually too benighted to notice this, but you can very much feel the grief and sadness written into every page of this book. This is both a good and a bad thing, as it makes for a powerful read, but also a depressing one, so it can be hard to get through if you're already feeling some of your own emotional angst that can be exacerbated. I actually think it's interesting to talk about this book in relation to its many sequels, in which the protagonist switches from Louis, the lead narrator in Interview, to Lestat, his vampire creator slash best friend slash lover slash deeply hated mortal enemy. Vampires are a little complicated in Rice's world. The first of these sequels was written 8 years later, after Rice had gotten her life back on track, so Interview almost comes off like one of those unaired TV pilots where the creators have figured out the world and the tone, but not the cast or the story arc. Rice apparently retconned a few of Interview's established rules and events in the second book, The Vampire Lestat, by claiming that Louis wasn't being entirely truthful about the way things happened, or was only presenting a one-sided, biased interpretation of them. I should really move on because, while fascinating, this isn't really the point of Lost in Adaptation, but if you would like to know more on this subject, you can watch Maven of the Eventide's videos on it. Vampires are kind of her thing, and she's given me a lot of helpful advice on these matters. And here is my very quick opinion on the film just as a film. Fair warning, while I, a self-confessed sensitive soul and horror wimp, wouldn't personally describe this as being particularly scary or gory, it is a vampire film, so images of blood, blood drinking, and death will be present. I liked this film a lot. It's well shot, it's got a great soundtrack, I was super impressed with the performances of all the cast, including 11-year-old Kirsten Dunst, who utterly shattered my usual dislike of child acting. Interview with the Vampire is somewhat famous for being the film that really brought the vampires are sex gods trope into the limelight. Other films had played around with the idea of them being handsome and alluring or sultry seductresses, but it was always presented in a "don't do it, people! If you fall off the purity wagon, you'll get a bad infection of death" sort of way. Interview revels in the decadent sexual pleasure of looking on the faces of Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, and Antonio Banderas, and makes no attempt to make people feel bad for doing so. I would say that the most compelling part of the film was its story, so let's take a look to see if that was purely its own strength or an inheritance from the book that came before it. Let's talk adaptation. In modern, for a given value of modern times, a reporter tracking a man to his temporary accommodations and asking him for an interview because he senses something deeply unusual about him. The man informing him that he is happy to give this interview as he wants his life story to be told, but that he is not in fact a man. He is a 200-year-old immortal vampire by the name of Louis, and proves it to him by displaying his supernatural speed and pale, inhuman complexion. Louis starting his life story in 1791 as a rich plantation owner in Louisiana, recently bereft of his loved ones, wandering through his his miserable life hoping someone would kill him and end his suffering. A vampire by the name of Lestat granting his wish and taking his life, but offering him a new immortal unlife in exchange. Louis accepting in a combination of fear of death and hope that existence as a vampire would be less miserable for him. Spoiler warning, it wasn't. It was so much worse. Watching his last sunrise before his transformation, and the process of turning a human into a vampire involving draining the human's blood, then feeding him the cursed vampiric blood flowing from one's own body. Louis becoming overwhelmed with the stunning beauty of the world as seen through his new enhanced vampire perceptions. Whoa, hey, why did that statue open its eyes? That's just weird. The revelation that despite most folklore concerning vampires being pure poppycock, they do apparently need to sleep in coffins at night. Louis not taking to life as a vampire very easily, as he's initially horrified by the idea of killing people, something that Lestat positively delights in, killing 2 to 3 innocents a night. Lestat's advice concerning drinking the blood of rats as a last resort if human victims are not available, one of the very few useful things he taught Louis about life as an immortal. Louis's African slaves becoming convinced that there is some straight up bad shit going on in the manor house and coming to the edge of full revolt and riot. Louis eventually going mad with the horror of his existence and burning his own home down. After traveling to New Orleans, Louis realizing that killing humans, despite still being abhorrent to him, somehow gives him a passing emotional respite from the pain of his existence, so easing up on his strict diet. The scene where Lestat sadistically plays with the escorts before killing them is in slightly the wrong place in the story, but it's very accurate in the details and almost word for word in the dialogue. Louis going for a walk and finding a girl desperately clinging to the corpse of her mother, recently deceased from an outbreak of plague, and being unable to resist his desire to feed on her. Lestat bursting in on them, elated that Louis is on the killing train now, and morbidly dancing with the body of the girl's mother, before bringing the child back to their place to turn her into a vampire, in a manipulative move to give Louis someone to love and keep him from leaving their new family. Yeah, it's basically the classic, well, maybe having a child together will fix this relationship in both the book and the film, and it has equally toxic and terrible results in both as it does in real life. Claudia, as he named the girl, almost over-draining Lestat's blood during the conversion process. The montage of the two of them being daddies to their little girl. You know, I kind of regret phrasing it like that, but I guess I'm committed now. Claudia taking to killing a lot more naturally than Louis ever did, luring her victims in by pretending to be a lost, helpless child, sleeping in Louis's coffin with him. Claudia eventually turning bitter towards her daddies, and Lestat in particular, because she is sick of being a child forever and resentful of them for turning her at such a young age. Louis confessing that while it was Lestat who fed her his blood, completing the process, it was he, her more gentle and loving father, who had fed on her, dooming her to die in the first place. Though, to be fair, her lifespan as an orphan living in the plague-decimated part of the city was probably never an optimistic one. Claudia stating that she hates both her daddies for it, but only avenging herself on the crueler of the two, tricking Lestat into drinking poison blood, then cutting his throat and press-ganging Louis into helping her dump his now shriveled body in the swamp. Louis and Claudia preparing to leave America in search of other vampires who could possibly explain the meaning of their existence to them, but finding to their horror that Lestat was only mostly dead. The fight between them and the resulting fire that appears to kill Lestat for the second time. Louis and Claudia making it to their transatlantic boat, which was unfortunately, at least for the other passengers, unusually rat-free. The two of them traveling around looking for their kin until they eventually find them, as Louis is approached by a vampire in Paris who makes a rather unusual introduction by mirroring his movements perfectly and acting like a bit of a buffoon. A less silly vampire by the name of Armand giving him a card inviting him to the theatre. The establishment turning out to be run by vampires pretending to be humans pretending to be vampires, though I will mention that the book didn't feel the need to spell this out in as many words like the film did. The vampire performers killing and feeding on a poor terrified girl on stage while none of the human audience noticed her death was not an act. Getting invited into the theatre's catacombs, which apparently it has, and meeting the little vampire society within. Armand having a human servant boy who willingly let vampires feed on him. Louis being deeply disappointed when Armand confirms that he is the oldest vampire that he knows of, but he is aware of no complex history of their people or greater meaning to their vampiric existence. Despite this, there is an instant, overwhelming connection formed between Armand and Louis. Armand deeply desiring some sort of relationship with Louis because he senses that still sympathetic to humans and loved ones Louis could break him out of the apathetic funk he'd fallen into over the last few centuries, and Louis seeing in Armand the vampire senpai he never had in Lestat. Armand casually mentioning to them that the only crime that he and his vampire friends would consider punishable is the act of a vampire killing another vampire in a sort of "we know what you did last summer, Claudia" way. Claudia, aware of their new bond and that Louis would probably be better off talk with Armand, but not wanting to be left all alone in the world brings a woman called Magdalene home and demands that Louis turn her so she can be her replacement companion. Magdalene, having recently lost her real daughter, is all for this pairing, so Louis unenthusiastically complies. Her being a very short-lived vampire due to Armand's acting troupe bursting in and grabbing her and Claudia, sentencing the latter to death for killing Lestat, and I guess dooming the former for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Louis being convinced that his new best friend Armand would not allow this, but being wrong. Louis getting locked in an iron coffin, then bricked up underground, eventually being rescued by Armand, but too late to save his beloved Claudia from getting exposed to sunlight. Louis getting revenge on them by burning the theatre to the ground and slicing the survivors to bits with a scythe. The scythe was a prop from the theatre, he wasn't just being really dramatic. Armand, now alone in the world, not attempting revenge on Louis because he knew his friends really had it coming, and still desperately wanting to be with him and making a pitch for it at the Louvre Art Gallery. Many years later, Louis coming across Lestat, surprisingly not dead once again, but a shadow of his former self, wrecked by not having Louis to look after him and his inability to adjust to the changing times around him. Upon the conclusion of the tale, the journalist, apparently missing the point of the whole story, demanding that Louis turn him into a vampire so he can be all cool and superpowered too, forcing Louis to go all hardcore creature of the night on him. I've spoken in the past about the pros and cons of using a narrator in adaptations, and tended to lean towards the opinion that it's kind of a lazy way to get out of adapting some of the best lines of the book into a visual medium. However, Interview with the Vampire has more justification for this than most due to the nature of the book, i.e. with the exception of the framing device, the story literally is a narration, so having a voiceover is technically true to the source material. There are a lot of direct quotes from the book in this film. Most of the really chilling lines were Rice originals, though hats off to Jordan for knowing how to incorporate them to such great effect and the actors for delivering them so well. I also adored the subtle accuracies they worked into the visuals. For example, after a while Claudia starts dressing like an adult despite still being in the body of a child. I think in general they did a really good job of recreating the emotional strain of being a vampire and all of the cast of characters' quiet desperation to find a coping mechanism for dealing with it, which is one of the main themes of the book. The other, the exploration of the philosophical nature of good and evil and a vampire's place in it, also gets some representation, even if it's not as prevalent as it was in the book, almost certainly for time constraint reasons. There's some stuff here that's a little hard to categorize because it's not technically loyal to Interview with the Vampire, but it is in keeping with later books in the Vampire Chronicles. Not surprisingly, a lot of it relates to Lestat. His ability to read minds is something that he apparently had all along, but it never came up in the first book because he apparently kept it hidden from Louis. His reasoning was his gloomy life partner was already pretty disgusted by all things vampire and he didn't want to make it worse. His ability to levitate is supposed to be something he picked up later in the 1980s, but I think we must forgive this early introduction because it sure does make for a cool visual at the start of the film. Tom Cruise does appear to have done his research, bringing to his performance some of the additional nuanced layers to the character of Lestat that Rice introduced in the sequels that he starred in. It's impressive how well he fits the role, considering he certainly wasn't Rice's first pick for Lestat and was almost certainly brought on just for his star power. While the film does cut back to the interview framing device occasionally, it's much more of a permanent feature in the book, mentioning how the boy, as he's exclusively referred to in the novel, reacts to parts of Louis' story at least once or twice a chapter. The boy is in general more confident in Christian Slater form. The poor bugger seemed thoroughly intimidated and in awe of Louis originally. While the makeup of the film is damn good, it doesn't quite capture the ethereal, inhuman, horrifying beauty of the vampires of the book, but of course that is one of those it's easy to write about, but how the hell do you actually visualize it adaptation things. Interestingly, the loved one that Louis was in mourning for in the book was his brother, not the wife and child of the film. His ill-fated sibling was a strange person to say the least. Okay, so he had this dream where he was informed by the powers of heaven that he was God's chosen one and he alone could bring peace to troubled France, so informed Louis that he was to sell his American plantation and give him all the money to fund his trip there and new religious campaign. Louis' response was, I think quite understandably, no. His brother's reaction, less understandably, was to immediately fall off the balcony to his death. Louis was never quite able to convince himself it was an accident. So, let's talk about the shipping. Interview with the Vampire is highly regarded in the LGBTQ community, and considering a large part of the story is about a girl and her two daddies, yeah, sure, I can see it. But is this a Rice thing or a Jordan thing? I think it's fair to say that in the Chronicles, vampires are not really interested in the act of having sex. It's implied heavily in an interview when Claudia asks Louis to describe intercourse to her, and he seems utterly unimpressed with the idea, and it's made even more blatant in the sequels. However, they do clearly yearn for emotional connections, be it with other vampires or even the odd human, and it comes across as a unique blend of romantic and platonic. Gender, race, and age appear to mean little to them as long as their partner can bring any sort of happiness to their unlives. Louis' relationships with Lestat, Claudia, and Armand are all like this. There's never any sexual chemistry, but it's clearly not devoid of romance with all three of them. Do you remember that Claudia is not a child for most of the book, even if she still looks like one? To a certain extent, I don't think you're supposed to fully understand how vampire romance works, as at the end of the day, they are not human, and the ways they form relationships are just different to what we're used to. They don't procreate via sex, so their drives are just fundamentally changed. However, if you really want to put a relatable label on it, I would say that Anne Rice's vampires are all sexually ace, but romantically bi. The film was inconsistent with how that was adapted into it. I mean, you can see the sexual chemistry radiating off some of these guys. But they cut out things like Lestat forgetting to get Louis his own coffin at first, so them literally sleeping on top of each other inside his for a while. So I guess the answer is both. The book and the film are on the same level of almost, but not quite openly gay, even if they go about showing it in different ways. Louis and Lestat went to greater pains to stay hidden from their slaves in the book, possibly because the physical differences between a human and a vampire were harder to miss. That Lestat enjoyed feeding on the aristocracy is mentioned in the book, but they go into more detail with a particular example in the film, i.e. the woman who had apparently conspired to murder her husband. Lestat seemed a little more loose-lipped about the vampire that turned him in the film, just a little. Aside from giving away that he didn't have a choice in the matter of becoming a vampire, he refused to say a single word about him in the book. At one point, Claudia theorizes that Lestat killed him before he could teach him anything about being a vampire, though we learn in the sequels that that wasn't quite the way of it. Claudia was only 5 when she became a vampire in the book. Her aging up to 12 in the film was almost certainly inevitable, as you just can't work with kids that young. It's a terrible idea. The fire that seemed to have killed Lestat for the second time was contained fairly quickly in the book, instead of burning down a good percentage of New Orleans like it did in the film. So dramatic. The book never mentions Dracula by name, so Film Louis' description of him being the vulgar fictions of a demented Irishman is a potshot either from a sequel novel or entirely of Jordan's making. Poor unlucky Magdalene gets a little more time as a vampire before she was burnt to a crisp in the book. You know, at least a few days where she got to go out and do all the fun vampire things like horribly killing people for food and fun. Louis getting to see a sunrise again when film is invented is a nice touch, though it's far too optimistic a scene to have been in the book that Rice poured so much of her grief into. Despite already coming back from the dead more times than a comic book superhero, Lestat did in fact make an additional appearance in the book. He's revealed to be in cahoots with Armand's theatre troupe and had tattletaled to them about Claudia's little murder attempt. He didn't appear to be fully in his right mind, as he was clearly still recovering from that, and then having had his head smashed in with a poker and set on fire shortly later. Armand's carriage rescue of Louis after his revenge spree would have been unnecessary in the book, as he had worked out his own escape plan and witless human helper. He was actually the one who saved Armand by giving him the heads up that he might want to sleep somewhere else that day. Book Louis had a habit of referring to anyone below the age of 50 as boys, so it's hard to know how old Armand's human snack assistant was. I hope that he was a little older than he appears in the film, because there's a detailed description of him getting an erection when Louis feeds on him, and that's just kind of uncomfortable making if he's just a wee lad. Armand casually mentions that he had killed this young man later in the book. He doesn't even bother giving a reason. One of the really horrifying things in this story was just how little value human lives held for most vampires. Antonio Banderas as Armand is one of my favourite parts of the film, but I can't deny that he's the least book-accurate character in the whole thing. Originally hailing from a part of the world that would eventually become Eastern Europe and Russia, he had the appearance of a shockingly beautiful auburn-haired 17-year-old in the book. There was apparently some concern that dialing up the homoeroticism in the film while keeping one of the participants an apparent juvenile would be perpetuating the dangerously inaccurate propaganda that conflated homosexuality with paedophilia, so they doubled the age of Armand's physical appearance. All the other changes, like him becoming a dark-haired Spaniard, are simply due to the producers wanting even more star power in the film and Antonio Banderas being hot shit in the 90s. More interestingly, unlike the film in which Louis declines Armand's friend request then and there, they do in fact team up and travel with each other for a few decades. The original reason that Louis went back to America was because Armand wanted to see where he grew up. Their eventual breakup when Louis finally realizes that he can never fully forgive Armand for his part in Claudia's death, and that hanging with him wasn't going to show him some greater truth about vampires no matter how much he wanted it to, is actually legit sad. Armand asks if there's anything else that Louis needs or that he can do for him, and then just walks away forever. Besides Armand, the other big deviation from the book is the ending of the story. Whereas in the film, Louis scares the shit out of Christian Slater but lets him go, only for him to be immediately attacked and possibly turned by a miraculously recovered Lestat, in the book, Louis said, fuck it, and fed on his new journalist friend himself when he just wouldn't shut the fuck up about wanting to be a vampire. Thoroughly drained of blood, the boy asked if he would die, to which a disinterested Louis responded that he didn't know before leaving him there. Fortunately, he did not, but when he came to the next morning, he realized that he might have a second shot at immortality, as Louis had mentioned the address that Lestat had shut himself up inside to waste away in forever, and the book ends on him presumably setting out to find him. There's no hint that Lestat would ever make a recovery in the book, however, as I said, in the sequels, Rice kind of retconned a few things in interview, including this ending. Lestat claims that Louis fabricated their entire last encounter and his enfeeblement to throw shade on him, and he actually spent that time buried underground doing some intense vampire slumbering and healing his many injuries, until he was woken up by the sound of metal music in the 80s and decided to become a rock star. Yeah, these sequels are really interesting, but they were way less lucky in their adaptation, and oh gods, I've just remembered that Queen of the Damned is on the Patreon to-do list too. Fuck! Before he would turn him, Lestat insisted that Louis prove to him that he was vampire material by watching him kill one of his employees, a man with a wife and kids, and do nothing to stop it. It was disturbing. There's been a lot of different takes on the process of becoming a vampire over the years. Most seem to go the route of the converting human, dying, and waking up as a vampire. Rice maintained that the transforming human is awake during the process and painfully aware of their body dying around them while their consciousness lives on, perpetuated by the dark magic that now runs in their blood. The film kept to this mostly, but they left out a key part of what happens when a human body dies, i.e. the complete evacuation of the bowels. Yes, I am trying to say that in the book, the first thing these uber-sexy vampires do upon gaining immortal life is shit themselves for like a solid 10 minutes. Now look with your vampire eyes, but do not fall so in love with the night that you lose your way. It is as if I've only just been able to see colours and shapes for the first time. Words cannot describe it. One might as well ask what heaven sees. I am very sorry, that's got to be the most lowbrow joke I've ever made on this show, but it had to be done. A very important detail about Lestat was left out of the film that sheds quite a lot of light on the guy's backstory and character. Namely, his human father was still alive, albeit old, blind, and frail. This confirms that Lestat was not that much older than Louis, at least in vampire terms. He also had an interestingly complicated relationship with his daddy, as he went through great pains to provide for him, but clearly deeply resented the man for being a shit to him in childhood, and honestly couldn't wait for him to die. Louis also had several other living relatives, including a little sister, who he protected and managed to hide his true nature from long enough for her to marry and move out. There were some nuances to the relationship between Louis and Lestat they understandably just couldn't work into the film. While you do see Louis coming to hate Lestat for being the sadistic embodiment of all things he loathes about vampires, you don't get to see the constant gaslighting Lestat took part in by routinely stating that he had more to teach his friend about life as a vampire, but never giving him the full story. You also don't quite get the same feel for the incredible superiority complex that Louis had in the book. It was kind of amazing how fast he went from being in awe of Lestat to deciding that he, Louis, was already a better vampire than his creator ever was. He came to view Lestat as the most basic of basic bitches within months of knowing him. It's pretty clear that this was partly because, as humans, Louis was a new money landowner and Lestat was a commoner. His bourgeois sense of social superiority transcended them becoming creatures of the night. Though, to be fair, he wasn't completely wrong. Lestat started his lifelong habit of ruining what could have been very poignant and romantic moments between them by not taking them seriously, literally the second after he turned him. Lestat, something is happening to me. You're just dying, that's all, don't be a fool. Don't you have any oil lamps? All this money and you can't afford whale oil. Dying. Dying! Man, look at these ledgers, you're fucking loaded. Can I buy a pony, Louis? I'm gonna buy a pony. Interestingly, in the book, Louis, a lifelong slave owner, becomes less racist after becoming a vampire, recognizing that there genuinely wasn't anything inferior about the African people he owned to anyone else living in the colonies. Unfortunately, this new understanding came combined with zero respect for any human life regardless of race, so things were actually much worse for his slaves because they had to deal with being food as well as denied their liberty. An early omission from the film was another rich family that lived on the plantation next to Louis'. The parents had died young, leaving their son Frenier to look after his multiple siblings sisters, including the eldest named Babette. Lestat became obsessed with the need to eat Frenier and ended up having the poor form to do so right after the poor bugger had just won a deadly duel with a Spaniard. Louis decided to try to help the family, so approached Babette in secret without revealing his vampire face to her. He shared some savvy business advice and gave her the confidence to run the plantation herself despite being a, gasp, woman. The reporter asked him if he was in love with her, and his answer was a non-committal, yeah, kinda sorta, it's weird for vampires, I just wanted her to be happy. Their relationship ends tragically though, as he's forced to come to her for a place to stay after he burns his home down and she finally sees what he really is. There's a confrontation that gets violent, and even though Louis manages to keep Lestat from killing her, it ended up making her lose her mind, and she's never the same way again. After this, there's a few occasions throughout the story where Louis is going through some emotional turmoil, pretty much his standard MO, and it looks like he's going to form another connection with a human, but chooses to cut these friendships off on their first day by drinking their blood and killing them instead. For example, a kindly priest listens to his confession, but also doesn't take the news that he's a vampire well. Louis later comes across a young artist in the streets of Paris who was very taken with his vampiric beauty and asked to be allowed to paint him. He feeds on the artist after he was barely started, which he ends up regretting when he sees how good the painting was gearing up to be. Before Claudia poisoned him, Lestat became very interested in a talented young musician, and they clearly had some sort of relationship going on. When he dragged himself out of the swamp, he tracked the lad down and turned him into a vampire to help him get revenge, though he appears to perish in the resulting fire. Weirdly, the film included a line of dialogue referring to him, even though the character himself was completely cut out.
And I'll tell you something else. I found someone who will make a better vampire than both of you.
They sort of skimmed over Louis and Claudia's travels around the world looking for their own kind in the film, so you don't see them finding a type of lower lifeform zombie vampire that was terrorizing the locals in Europe. They end up killing it in self-defense, then ironically pose as vampire hunters in order to get shelter for the day at an inn. They left out a rather significant moment from the book in which Armand and Louis climb a building together, and feeling guilty that Louis was clearly so traumatized from the act of turning Madeleine into a vampire, Armand admitted that he had used his mind-influencing powers to push him into doing so because he wanted Louis for himself so much and thought it would make his breakup with Claudia easier. Final thoughts. I would describe this film as a slightly abridged version of the book story, but undeniably the book story nonetheless. Like I said, I thought one of the key themes of the book was vampire kind trying to psychologically cope with being vampires, either through internalized misery, apathy, sadism, or whatever the hell these guys were doing, and they really incorporated that into the film well in my opinion. Combine this with the loyalty to the plot and the dialogue lifted right out of the book, and yeah, you got yourself a damn good recreation. They may have selected their cast based on star power, but they really lucked out on how well each one turned out to be suited for the role they were playing. Like I said at the start, despite reports, I don't think I could guess who wrote this movie because of how loyal it is to the book. It could easily have been Rice protecting her own story, or Jordan just being really respectful of it because he's an author as well. In the very unlikely event that they haven't seen it, I would recommend this film to fans of the book, as I don't think it would disappoint them, and I would recommend the book to fans of the film, as they would probably enjoy the extra chapters that didn't quite make it to screen. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. Speaking of dark, unholy curses that make you question the nature of good, evil, and the value of life itself, do remember that YouTube is a very well-crafted algorithmic hellscape that likes to feed on those dependent on it, and you can only defend your favorite creators from it by liking, commenting, and sharing their videos. If you're new here, don't forget to sink your teeth into that like button, and I will see you soon. Much love and appreciation to my patrons of honor, Shelby Holtz and Matthew J. Brish. Hello again, my beautiful watchers. I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder that there's a wonderful website called Patreon that's been allowing online producers to actually make a living doing what they do, since apparently YouTube's decided that they shouldn't anymore. Basically, they offer the chance to pledge a certain amount of money per month or per video in exchange for various rewards offered by the creator. There's a variety of stuff you can earn by becoming one of my patrons, including early access to all videos and taking part in that survey you see at the start of every Lost in Adaptation episode. That's actually a very important part of the process, as I use it to gauge how much I'm going to need to explain about the book and the film before I start comparing them. If you decide to become a higher level contributor, your name will be added to the credits that you're seeing right now, and you'll be given the option to join my private chat room so you can regularly talk with me and other patrons. If you're keen enough to join the topmost tier of patronage, you'll earn the most coveted of all the rewards, the chance to pick a future adaptation to be reviewed by yours truly. However, if right now you are thinking, my goodness the Dom, I can't do that, I mean, mean, I was going to. I found a magic lamp that granted me 3 wishes, and I meant to wish for infinite wealth, but, well, long story short, I have 3 jetpacks now. Fear not, it would still be a huge help to me if you were to give that like button the old clickaroo, share this episode on social media with perhaps a little recommendation to your friends to check it out, and subscribe if you've not already. It really helps my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. I hope you have a most pleasant day, and I will see you in the next episode. Whoa, Jesus. I'm okay. I'm okay. Forgot my teeth. Got to put things in. Got to put things in. Get on in there. Shut up, puppers. It's not balking time. It's not filming time. Oh, okay, well, forget the mustache. I got a robocall. No, don't suspend my social security number. Back off. Someone's in a hurry. Oh, that's a helicopter. Oh, my knee. I'm old. Oh, that hurt. Oh, got a really bad knee. As they would probably get some extra chapters out of the words that form good. I'm tired. I'm gonna DoorDash me some coffee.